event. It's been organised through our Chartered Heritage, obviously, because we wouldn't be here without the hub. And it's a wonderful location, and glad to see people beginning to make use of it. And people have nothing at all to do with this, but it's a wonderful display that's been presented to us. And I hope more and more people, you will tell them to come and have a look and hopefully buy something as well, so that the money comes in and keep it going. There's unlimited time. We're not at the beginning of that now, so hopefully it will build up and be very successful over the next 18 months or so. And the 3 events we've had so far, 6 points, is I'm here talking about a publishing group. We are completely voluntary, not out to make money, but there's no money to be made with printing, publishing books, but not a great deal anyway, unless you go for blockbusters. But it's really, I mean, I find it amazing that these outfits are now being quoted on the stock exchange, some of them, but including bookshops. That it's, or trying, because they're thinking about it. We're in the business of trying to get to publish things that haven't been published, and the story here that we've got in South Wales and beyond, into other parts of Wales, across the waters in Bristol and around the southwest and beyond, it's just amazing. This period of history, on which there's a take that we are challenging in a way. Look at the evidence, really think about it. And we've published a few books already, but more on the hopefully coming. Our speaker this afternoon is one of the people with 6 points as well. The 3 of us started it.
Yeah.
So he has volunteered to come along to talk today. Now, as I say, we've had 3 lectures. The first one took us down the road of transportation, so that's global. That's one theme we're hoping to see pursued in future talks. The second I started last week, which is looking at the political ideas behind the Charter. And that's a big, big topic when you start looking, because everyone talks rightly about the 6 points, but how did it come about? And when we started looking last week, I think we only just touched the edges of the whole discussion about what really was behind it, where did these ideas stem from, and it takes you way back into history. But today we're looking at something that, again, I think is another theme that we want to pursue, and that's the authorities at the time, and what they thought about Chartism. So we start, no better place than the Westgate Inn, as it was then. Granby decided to call itself a hotel, I think probably as a result of the publicity gained by what happened in 1839 in November the 4th. But I'm not going to tread on your Ray's toes here. I'll hand it over to Ray, who's going to talk about the 45th, the men at the West that defended the Westgate.
Thanks, Les. Well,
Ray Stroud.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm Ray Stroud. A long time ago, I used to be a teacher, to teach history, and that sort of carried over in my love of Newport history and Welsh history and Chartism in particular. I was fortunate enough when I was a student in Swansea University to be taught by Professor David Jones, who I think still has written the best book on the Newport Rising, The Last Rising, which was published in the mid-1980s now. But I think with the advent of the internet, I think there's so much more material to be found, and you know, all of us can be historians these days. We can all, it's the democratization of history in a sense. We can go online and we can find documents and archival materials. So I would encourage you to look at things. As Les said, I want to talk about the regiment that came here in October of 1839, the 45th Regiment of Foot, the Sherwood Foresters. I must stress I'm not a military historian, and military history doesn't really interest me that much. But there's something about this particular topic which has drawn me to it. My main interest at the moment, the work that I'm doing, is working on 5 men who were sentenced to death at Monmouth, along with Williams, Frost and Jones, and those 5 men were then sent to the Millbank Penitentiary in London. So I'm hoping to publish work on that with 6 points fairly soon. But for today, we're going to look at the soldiers. So I'm sure this is probably the most famous image of the Rising. Mullock's picture, he was actually present and produced this lithograph of the Rising. But we tend to focus on the Chartists, probably quite rightly. But inside the Westgate were these men of the 45th Regiment of Foot. And I sort of want to pose the question, who were they really? And I'd say straight away, I haven't got all the answers. The records are very, very difficult to interrogate and to find exactly what I would like to find and many others would like to find. But this is just a kind of discussion topic really, and we will have a time afterwards if you want to ask some questions and if we want to discuss some of these issues. I know that Les and Dave May have got some things that they want to mention as discussion points. So who were these men and what was their role? Well, we go back to the regiment itself, and there's not a great deal written on the 45th. I've got a very old volume here which is written by a sort of major. It's a typical army history really, and it's very much praising the gallant 45th, and it's quite biased towards the establishment, but it's a useful book to look at. I just bought that second hand, so just mention that. If we go back to where they were based for much of this period. I'm talking about the early 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars. They were based in India and near Madras actually. Now Madras was a major centre for the military within India and was home to Fort St George, which had been built back in the 17th century as a military garrison. And of course the connections with the very, very famous East India Company and their trading post. Just some images of that's the fort itself. And if you look at it today, the building is still impressive. I think it's a monument to the empire and all that goes with that. I mean, these are the kind of early years of really establishing what became the great empire of late Victorian period, and very much reinforced by the military and the risings against the British military. But if we return home and just have a look at what happened then, the 45th Regiment between March and October of 1838, as they returned from India, were moved around a fair bit, and the biggest event really that I just mentioned is what happened in Kent at Bossington Wood. And that's often referred to as the last rising of agricultural labourers. And I just brought probably the book on this event. It's written by, I think, a historian from New Zealand called Barry Ray. And he's talked about what happened as agricultural workers, very discontented, with some, I would say, quite misguided principles of what they were going to achieve, were fired upon by the 45th. And that's where I suppose the 45th first came to prominence in the early part of the 19th century. Did I go that way? There we go. Okay. So, in May 1839, we have movement of the 29th Regiment of Foot. We're going to talk about those as well. These things are going on sort of in parallel to two regiments. So the 45th Regiment of Foot that I've just been mentioning at Bosley Wood, but another regiment which are very much connected with Newport is the 29th Regiment of Foot. In May of 1839, the 29th Regiment of Foot came here to Newport to deal with what was concerning the authorities, particularly with the rise of Chartism. It's interesting that, and this slide is probably in the wrong place actually, but it's interesting that more than a dozen soldiers in the 6 months that they were here deserted, and we'll say more about desertions as we go through. But going back to Bossington Wood and the 45th, this was quite a major incident really, and as the soldiers fired on these men, a number of the soldiers were wounded, and one of the officers was killed. This slide work. And here he is, Henry Boswell Bennett, from the 45th Regiment of Foot, and this monument is in Canterbury Cathedral, remembering this soldier was killed, and some of the protesters were killed as well, and the rising was crushed in quite a cruel way, really, hence the reputation of the 45th Regiment of Foot. In fact, when we get to the time of the Newport Rising, our newspaper here in Monmouthshire, the Monmouthshire Merlin, still made reference to what had happened at Bossenden Wood, and it says there, the gallant 45th that were led by Captain Stack had been involved in the Kentish riots, and Sir William Courtney, as he called himself, who led that rebellion, had been put down. There's a picture from the time of the Bossenden Wood rebellion. So the reputation of the 45th Regiment of Foot was quite a fierce one, really. They had a reputation, as this piece from David Jones' book mentions, they had a reputation as crowd controllers. They were a military unit that could put down serious problems of sedition and revolt. And this is probably the reason why they came to Newport. I mentioned the 29th just now. The 29th Regiment came to Newport in the spring of 1839, but were very unsuccessful really in dealing with some of the problems that presented themselves here in South Wales. And so it was felt necessary to replace that regiment with the 45th, probably for this reason. And I'll just highlight some of these points. I'm not going to read all of this, but I thought this is quite interesting, what appears in the newspapers. The nature, the kind of people that were in the 45th Regiment of Foot. And we see here in April, drunk and disorderly behaviour by the 45th Regiment of Foot in Windsor where they were based. A serious disturbance took place in Windsor between parties of the regiment and horse soldiers of cavalry, and there were charges sent for that. There was a court-martial for stealing a shirt. Another soldier was ordered to receive 200 lashes as a punishment. I think that's a slight exaggeration. I think 200 lashes, even by military standards, was too much. I think the maximum was probably about 150. And actually he only received, I say only, 25 lashes. Then there was a meeting in Windsor, and 250 men from the 45th decided to abstain from distilled liquors and 20 from all intoxicating drink. More incidents, people roughing up other people in the street, fighting. And so in October 1839, as I've said, they were quartered in Windsor, but they were told that they were going to leave Windsor and they were going to march, that meant actually walking, to South Wales to replace the 29th Regiment of Foot. And what we see is a dispersal here of different companies of the 45th. The company that was sent here were the 8th Company of the 45th Regiment of Foot, but other companies were moved to Winchester, and others went to different directions as well. And this is what we see. I've just tried to put that onto a map, really, where these regiments were, or companies of the regiments were sent in October. So we've got the one that concerns us here. The 8th Company were moved to Newport under Captain Richard Stack. Another company was sent to Trowbridge. Then Colonel Boyce led the remainder of the 45th to their headquarters down in Winchester. And we see this is the main focus for the 45th, this southern part of England and Wales. Meanwhile, the 29th went the other way. So they were told to leave I think they left on the 9th of October. They were withdrawn to Woolwich Barracks. And Ivor Wilkes, the historian, says the reason was the extent to which they were becoming disaffected So we see this change that I've just talked about. Nice picture there of Sheet Street in Windsor, where the military barracks were, which housed the bulk of the troops actually for the whole United Kingdom, were based in Windsor. And we see the route that the 45th would have taken. The beginning of October, they left Windsor, marched all this way, the Great Western Route, to Bristol, and then they would have caught the ferry across and arrived in Newport.
How long was the march?
It would have taken them probably about a week
Yeah.
to make their way. Sorry, my slide. There it is, my slide. If we look at some of the military records, what's nice about these is you can actually find, these are online, you can find some of the names of the leading people involved in the story of the Newport Rising. There was only one major senior officer, and that was Captain Richard Stack, as we've said, who was an Irishman. And then he had a Lieutenant Basil Gray, and then Ensign Frederick Stack was Richard Stack's son, and they marched together. And we'll say a little bit about particularly the first of those in a moment. Basil Gray is a very interesting character. David Osmond and I have not long finished curating an art exhibition in the Museum and Art Gallery. And one of the pictures that we had on display there was a picture of Basil Gray, and that picture was acquired in the 1880s by the museum. It was actually commissioned in the 1840s for this sort of hero of the Rising, but it was in a very poor state. In fact, that's one of the pictures before it was restored. We had it restored by a professional conservator, and the story of Basil Gray sort of runs through what I'm going to talk about today. He was actually born in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka. He was very much part of a military family, and he possibly was at Bosenden Wood, but I think it was probably unlikely that he was there. He certainly was aware that he'd lost a fellow officer who had been killed at Bosenden Wood. He was then, for what happened at the Westgate Inn, he was promoted to captain very, very quickly. He received an audience with Queen Victoria, and he was later promoted to major on the insistence of the Duke of Wellington. And he retired early. He wasn't a well man. He retired early on half pay. He died, though, in 1889. He lived a lot longer than many of the other soldiers that come into this story. And we found through the family, just stand back a little bit, we found a story about him, because one of his descendants was actually given the most prestigious of rewards, Victoria Cross, in the First World War. So in 1916, this article appeared in the Argus, and it said that Lieutenant Richard Basil B. Jones had been honoured with the award of Victoria Cross, and that he was the grandnephew of Lieutenant Basil Gray. And there's a picture of him there that appeared in the newspaper. But of course it makes the connection between the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of the Westgate. And in doing so, we've got a very nice picture. It's a bit grainy, but it's the only one we've got. But there is Basil Gray, as he was as an old man. So the young man who was only 30 at the time of the Newport Rising, here he is as an old man in the 1880s. And it says, what I've just said, his picture hangs at Newport Museum, and now the heroic death of his grandnephew recalls once more his share in the making of history. The other officer, Richard Stack, is also a very interesting man. I've just put a little bit about his life. Sadly, he died almost to the day, I think it was the 5th of November, a year after the Rising. And a number of them died in 1840. There's a lot of illness going around, lots of diseases. But he again was from a prestigious Irish military family, as the Limerick Standard tells us. I'm not going to read all of that now, but he'd served in the Peninsular War, in the Napoleonic period. He'd been born, he was much older than Gray. He'd been born in 1786. Now, one of the problems, and this is something maybe if you want to raise this afterwards, is the state of the army at this particular moment in time, because there was a severe shortage of numbers within the military, and the British Army had passed really through a cloud in the years that followed the Napoleonic Wars that ended with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Its slogan had been very much peace, retrenchment and reform, to cut down the size of the army. Maybe there are parallels with today here, as we see this in the news now with what's happening in Russia. I can certainly recommend this book, actually. It's an old book, it's from the 1950s, but if you can get hold of it, Mather's book, Public Order in the Age of the Chartists, and it gives a lot of information about the state of the army and the way in which Chartism was perceived by the authorities in this period. And I've just added there, within the Newport and South Wales context, from David Jones's book, that since the Merthyr Rising of 1831, soldiers had been slowly removed from the mining districts of South Wales, and so that by the summer of 1839 there were only about 400 raw recruits, those based at Brecon Barracks and also at Newport and Abergavenny. And David Jones has made this point, he made this point in the 1980s. I think one of the reasons that the Newport Rising took place when it did was because the numbers of troops were so small, and the Chartists knew that. It's an opportunity. Maybe if they were going to seize control of South Wales, if not the whole of the United Kingdom, this is one opportunity to take. I've taken this from Mather's book. I think you can see the decline from the 1820s right through until the late 1830s, the decline in soldiers, and we've got a total in this column here for 1820 of 7,500. And this is just for one district, by the way. This is for the northern district, because the country was divided into military districts. But by the time we get to the beginning of 1839, that number is down to just over 5,000, although it's beginning to rise from what it had been in 1837. And I think part of that is a recognition and awareness by the government that the Chartists represented a threat to the establishment. And I mentioned the slight breakdown again from Mather. The country was divided into districts. So North Britain was the name that they used for Scotland. The biggest area was the Northern District, probably made famous by a very famous soldier, Major General Sir James Napier. And there was about 7,500 men, as I've said, based there. Then you had the Midland District. Most of the soldiers were in barracks in sort of Windsor and London. And then after the Rising, we have the creation of this district for Monmouthshire and the adjacent Welsh counties, when Colonel Considine was given that very prestigious position of controlling this area, but still with a reasonably small number of men, about 1,800. And if we project forward, if we go through into the 1840s with Chartism, I think we see this problem with plug plot as well, that military was in such a state that it found it very difficult to control major centres such as Manchester. And there's a quote which says that the military were utterly incapable of supplying aid to the neighbouring towns in Manchester, in Lancashire. And this is 1842. So we have to realise that there was potential here for revolution, and that the military maybe weren't sufficient to deal with that threat. Certainly in the late 1830s and early 1840s, we could project that forward to 1848, but I'm not going to deal with that today. So, the Rising itself, which is the theme obviously for the work that we seem to be fascinated with in our Chartist heritage and here at the Hub and 6 Points and other organisations. The Rising, the early morning of Monday the 4th of November 1839, and what transpired. So the 45th are now based in Newport. They've been placed and lodged in the newly constructed workhouse, which is now St Woolas Hospital. The regiment that's been here from the spring of 1839, the 29th Regiment of Foot, have been kicked back to their barracks in London. And the Chartists in South Wales, the intelligence is coming through, something is going to happen, something is going to transpire, but they're not sure exactly what at this point. So, in the hours before the rising, particularly the Saturday and the Sunday of that weekend, there was a lot of information being passed around. There were arrests by special constables and policemen in the early hours, should be hours, of Monday morning. And it was quite clear that trouble was going to take place. Thomas Phillips, the mayor, the personal enemy of John Frost, had been receiving information since about Thursday that the feeling was running very high amongst the South Wales miners, the Monmouthshire miners in particular. And so on Saturday he warned Captain Stack of the 45th that he and his 70 infantrymen needed to be ready for a surprise attack. And he also ordered the head of police here, a very small police force in Newport, but the chief of police in Newport, Ed Hopkins, to summon 150 special constables to be on duty that evening. The idea was they were going to break that 150 into 3 batches of 50 and place them at various locations such as the Parrot and the Westgate, and that they were going to try and manage that with special constables. Now these are volunteers really. It's a bit like Deputy Dog, you stick the badge on, you go and do your stuff. In fact, way less than 150 actually turned up. Don't blame the poor beggars really. They didn't turn up to take on between 7,000 and 10,000 armed Chartists. Nevertheless, there were many of those special constables who really gave everything to the defence of the Westgate. So as I said, the soldiers were in the workhouse. It's a contemporary map of the workhouse. And through the hours, there was communication between the Westgate, between Phillips, and as these other locations, such as the police headquarters on Stow Hill, halfway up Stow Hill, and the Parrot Inn, that communication was very much expecting trouble, and indeed one of the leading magistrates, who was no friend of the Chartists, Lewis Edwards, of Bryn Hyfryd, he was then at the workhouse with the men of the 45th. Meanwhile, in the night hours before the attack of the Chartists, there was lots of concern about the areas, both in the valleys. Risca was one area, and also here the Marshes Gate, which, if you know where James and Emmanuel's garage is, where the Marshes Gate used to be, bringing the main route artery from Pontypool into Newport. And of course this is one of the routes that some of the Chartists, the Pontypool Chartists, decided to take. And then they went up most of them went up what we call today Barrack Hill. It was Penlan Hill in those days. So some of those were arrested, some were released, some were taken to the workhouse, and Captain Stack was told that night that as far as possible he should keep his soldiers out of sight and only fire if they were attacked. The message came in the very early hours, probably around about 8 o'clock in the morning, from Thomas Phillips, the mayor, to the workhouse, to Stack, that he needed to send soldiers to defend the Westgate. And about half of them, a bit less than half of them, were sent marching down Stow Hill to be placed in the Westgate under Captain Stack. And this is what David Jones says. He says, Lieutenant Gray, Sergeants Daly and Armstrong, and 28 privates arrived and stood guard at the front of the hotel. He makes the point, they were young, inexperienced, and predominantly Irish soldiers, and they located themselves in a room on the east side of the hotel. Here is Stow Hill coming down. This is where the battle took place, and at this point, this is where the soldiers were to be found. So by 9:20 a.m., the soldiers were still hidden behind the shutters. But people had seen them. People had seen the 45th as they assembled on the main street there. And Phillips knew that something was going to happen. He had a copy of the Riot Act in his pocket. And he'd hoped really to avoid any violence, to avoid a clash between the soldiers and the Chartists. But now the situation was very, very quickly getting out of control. And what we see then, of course, is the attack on the Westgate by the Chartists, armed with a range of weapons, a lot of them homemade, a lot of them farm implements, knives stuck on poles, all sorts of things. You can read of the whole collection of weapons that were picked up off the floor after the attack. Some guns, not a large number of guns, but some guns. Sorry, there is a gun by here actually, which I'm told I can pick up. So, don't feel very comfortable with this one. I never wanted to be a soldier, I have to say. Teaching was enough of a battle in itself. Of course, when we look at the weapons that the Chartists had, I mean, some of them were fairly skillfully made because a lot of them were ironsmiths. You know, they grew up in the iron industry. They were able to forge weapons like this rather sophisticated pike. There's some musket balls there that have been produced by a man called Evan Edwards from Tredegar. But really they were no match for a military outfit that were battle hardened, even if many of them were young raw recruits. So, inside the Westgate, we find the traditional view was that the Chartists fired first. I know that is very much debated. David Jones says an alternative view is that it may have been accidental. But the order was then given for the military to load its rifle with ball shot, and in that fire then, the crossfire, both the mayor and Sergeant Daly were quite badly hurt. The mayor was shot through the arm, Daly was shot through the head with slugs, but neither of them died. They were just badly injured. They were shot by snipers, and then the young soldiers filed past the windows, and the shout went to fall off, and the Chartists retreated, says David Jones. Now, there were different weapons. They were quite old weapons, really, within the military. There was the Black Bess, and I'm told the Brown Bess as well. I think told this is a Brown Bess, David?
Brown Bess, yeah.
Do people want to have a little look? It's quite heavy. Anybody want to have a look at that? Shall I fire at you? You wouldn't like that. If you would like to have a look at that, well, I'm just talking about what happened in my... This is what in school teaching we'd call sort of tactile teaching, where you can touch the objects. It's heavy too. Basil Gray made the point that the soldiers always had the upper hand, even though they were massively outnumbered. We're talking about 32 men against 7,000. But they were soldiers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think the Chartists, a lot of the stories that you read say that the Chartists expected that the soldiers would put down their weapons. There was even a story which said that the Chartists should turn up with an extra coat to give to the soldiers to replace their red tunics. At the end of the day, ultimately, the soldiers were prepared to fire on the Chartists. And that's what we get here. Gray told his men to load. Gray gave the order to fire. The soldiers set a volley right into the crowd. And then we've got chaos. It says the passages of the Westgate were filled with smoke, and chaos transpired. I mean, think of what was going on. Not a pretty picture. I always think of poor George Shell. I'm sure you know the story of George Shell, who was one of the first to die in the Westgate, lying, bleeding. The coroner's report said he was shot. The bullet went right through into his lung. It took him 3 hours to die bleeding to death in the hallway, the entrance of the Westgate Inn. And of course, we still have the bullet holes lodged in the pillars, which I think we've conclusively been able to prove actually were the original musket balls from the conflict in 1839. The military sent then an artist, and he produced this sketch, rather lovely drawing of what transpired, still with the bodies lying, and one under by here. And of course we've got a diagram which graphically shows where the bodies fell as they tried to get in and maybe assassinate Mayor Phillips. So the rising had finished, and this was time now for some kind of retribution. The remainder of the 45th arrived very shortly, and then the town had nearly 700 of that regiment within it, and other regiments as well, cavalry regiments. Every inn, every hotel, every public house was completely packed out. There was no space in Newport as these soldiers came in and were placed onto the town, and the process of the magistrates of dealing with this was well underway. I'm not going to read the slide, but it talks about, this is from a newspaper called Examiner, and it talks about the soldiers and the bravery of what became very quickly in the press known as the Gallant 45th. It's the creation of typically Victorian style, isn't it, by Jingo. It's the creation of this myth, or was it a myth, of the Gallant 45th that had served their country. Look on the newspapers. You can get access online to newspapers. Some of it is free, for example, on the National Museum of Wales, National Library of Wales, I should say. On their site you can have a look at the newspapers. The newspapers throughout the UK flooded with these stories. The whole of England, Wales, Scotland, and particularly Ireland were absolutely fascinated by what was going on here in South Wales. And what follows next, of course, is the removal of the bodies. They've been placed in the stables here in the Westgate. And this is from a Kent newspaper which says that the military escorted the bodies, and it says the warnings which their untimely and wretched deaths afford will not be thrown away on their deluded fellow men. And we think 10 men were buried here outside the St Mary's Chapel in St Woolas. We don't know where they are exactly. We'd like maybe with some geophysics to be able to locate their bodies. How many graves were there? On the parish records it says 4 graves. I've got a theory, not everybody agrees with it, but I think there was 3 in one grave, 3 in another, 3 in another, and George Shell had his own grave. From what I've read, that's my conclusion, but not everybody agrees with that, so I'm fine with that. And some other correspondence actually says 9 men, not 10. It's quite confusing. But this is actually the coroner's report, and the only one it mentions here is George Shell. It says John Shell, he calls him here. And it says that he was shot in the act of rebellion by some person unknown in defence of himself. And then here's all the others, the other 9, man unknown, it says. And very cynically here, this is the cost for the coroner, the price of dealing with those bodies he was paid for. So who are these men? Keep an eye on my watch. Who are these men inside the Westgate? As I say, I can't give you definitive answer, but it's interesting to be able to pour into the records and try and find something about who they were. In December 1839, a Newcastle newspaper said this, that the party of the 45th Regiment that had defeated the Chartists were composed of 17 English, 8 Irish, and 6 Scots soldiers. I've no idea where they got those figures from at all. I shall tell you more in year, 2 years, 10 years time. But I thought it's worth mentioning. It's interesting that they come up with those figures. I can't see a lot of justification for it from what I've been able to find. Okay, I've been doing a little bit of digging in the last few weeks, knowing I was going to give this talk today, of the 2 sergeants that were with the officers in Newport at that time. Daly we've mentioned. I'm pretty sure, and it's pretty clear, he came from County Tyrone. He was born in about 1806, would have made him in his early 30s at that time. And we know that he was shot in the head, and I think probably what happened is that the musket balls got lodged under the skin. Some accounts say he had 2 slugs, some say 6. So I'm not sure which of those is true. Interestingly, later on, those slugs were advertised as memorabilia that people could look at. If we move on 50 years, the slugs, along with all sorts of other things that were found in the Westgate in the 1880s. He was discharged this is the discharge records here for 1840, and he ended up working in the Tower of London. And Sergeant John Armstrong, his colleague, again I've done some digging, I think he was from County Armagh, and he became a yeoman warder in the Tower, and a lot of that was to do with the Duke of Wellington, who insisted he should be rewarded with a place. So it's quite prestigious. So I've been helped a little bit with the archivist from the Tower of London with some of this information. He's given me some records. And what he told me I didn't know is that actually Armstrong didn't live very long. In fact, he died in 1843. So I'm trying to trace the families, the children as well. I'm afraid it's a typical thing with history. Not all the records are there, but we dig and we dig until we maybe find a little bit more. I've got some of the census records, which shows you here Armstrong. It says warder in the Tower along with his wife Mary and his 2 children, 2 servants there as well. It's from 1841. I couldn't find Daly in the 1841 census at all, but he's there in 1851, where it says here he was a yeoman of the guard. And again, with his family, interesting, his wife was from Scotland, so I need to find a little bit more about that family if I'm able. And someone else I found, it turns up in a newspaper in 1884 for Shrewsbury, was a man called John Ellis, who was the quartermaster sergeant of the 45th. And there's a long article, again, I'm not going to read it all, but you can find it for yourself if you want to look for it. It talks about having fought in the Kaffir and Burmese wars, and then here he was, the 30 men of the 45th, under the command of Ensign Stack, Sergeant Lambert, another name, Sergeant Daly, and Sergeant Armstrong. So there's another man of that list that we can tick off. But something we need to touch on, if very briefly, is the level of desertion in the military at this time. What the Rising showed was the soldiers were perfectly willing to obey their officers and to fire at the Chartists, at the workers, even though they, as the Chartists assumed, were working men themselves. Their loyalty was very much to their uniform. The flip side of that is that there were masses of desertions, and particularly when the whole of the 45th were moved here after the Rising. In the 8 months from late November 1839 to the end of July 1840, there were over 100 desertions. I have to tell you, looking at military records, desertions were far more common in the military as a whole than you might suspect. I'm trying to look, I don't know if we've got time to talk about this today, something I'm trying to do desperately is find this man called Williams the Deserter, who was one of the first men killed at the Westgate. All the books say he was a deserter from the 29th Regiment of Foot. But I don't think he was in the 29th Regiment of Foot when they were in Newport. And I found a record, a letter, which I don't think anybody else has managed to find. I contacted a very famous Irish historian, he knew nothing of it. I found a letter written by an Irishman in Dublin saying, I knew this man, and that effectively the name Williams was an alias, and he'd fought in Spain in the Carlist Wars, and he was, and Les, I think, maybe thinks he might have even been agent provocateur, possibly, along with others like Jack of Fife.
Mercenary, effectively in Spain, isn't it? But, yeah.
I mean, the books say he was a quartermaster for the Chartists, that he was involved in training the Chartists ready to attack. Yeah. But digging up things like that is very, very difficult. There are a couple of leads. In fact, Wilkes names in his book who he thinks this man was. I think Wilkes is wrong, personally. I think with more evidence that's available. I have found some records of such a man being court-martialed in Plymouth, I think, Plymouth or Portsmouth, I can't remember which. And there are a number of examples. There's I won't go into it now, but it's got the famous Samuel Victory case where soldiers were being provided with drink and food and being encouraged to desert. There's one here that appears in the Hereford Journal, the two men from the other side of the border, John Morris and John Macken, privates in Newport in the 45th, were taken to a public house, were given working class clothes, and ended up coming back to face the authorities, having deserted. And it says here that they awaited in the county prison the verdict that was going to be placed on them. So there were lots of desertions.
What's the date of that one?
This one is,
Morris,
I haven't got the date there, Les. It's
It's
after the rising, but not long after.
Right.
I can find out for you,
Okay,
sorry.
yeah.
Now, I just throw this one in for discussion, talking about who are these men. I swallowed hard, blinked at my bank balance and decided to buy this a year or so ago. Ridiculously expensive, I think it was like 60 quid, this book. It's the latest book in a series on soldiers written by Nick Mansfield. And this one's called Soldiers as Citizens. And in this book, he asserts that faced with desertions from the 29th Regiment of Foot, the authorities brought in the 45th Regiment, and the Westgate Garrison was possibly, or was specially selected because it mainly contained Irish Protestant soldiers. I'll say that again. These men of the 45th were selected because they were mainly Irish Protestant soldiers. Now, I ask myself, how true is that? It goes against all my gut. Where does he get that from? He doesn't give a great deal of explanation. So let's look at some of the evidence. Okay. The overwhelming story in the press at this time, the Irish press mainly, was that these were young, raw Irish Catholic boys. Okay, not Protestant, Catholic. And much of the reason for this was the story that was spread by Daniel O'Connell, that sort of folk hero of Irish history. Think of the Catholic Emancipation Act of the 1820s. And he made a speech and he sent a letter to a fellow Irishman, and he says, "It was we that beat the Chartists at Newport. 28 poor raw Irish lads beat 5,000 rebels. And Captain Stack is a Kerry man, and I do believe a papist, Catholic. At all events, Sergeant Daly and the privates are all Irish papists." So no mention of an Englishman. Remember that newspaper in Newcastle,
Yeah.
English, Scots?
Yeah.
Nothing of that. They're all Irish, and they're not just all Irish, they're all papists, they're all Catholics. That's what he said. Now, this idea quickly hit the newspapers, so I'm going to stand back and just read some of this. We've got a very prominent newspaper, the Dublin Morning Register. This is November the 27th, just 3 weeks after the Rising, saying, "We point to the conduct of that handful of gallant youths." And it says, "The few but true soldiers of the 45th Regiment who routed these thousands were papists." It talks about the gallantry of these Irish lads. "We are proud of our countrymen." And it says, they routed the misguided Chartists and the total suppression of a rebellion. This was all to do with young Irish Catholic lads. It goes on, and it was a big headline in the newspapers. Are the Irish papists loyal? Not just the soldiers now, but the population of the Irish population of England, Wales, and Scotland. Are they loyal? And it points to the conduct of these soldiers who, in the defence of their sovereign and the Constitution, repelled the mad outbreak of the armed thousands of Newport. The few but true soldiers of the 45th Regiment who routed these thousands were papists, and the peaceful inhabitants of Newport are loud in their gratitude. The coolness, the moderation, the gallantry of these Irish lads. You get the idea, you get the picture. of what they're trying to say. Okay, and it talks about the Irish people who lived in Newport. It says 100 of the Irish who live in Newport applied to be sworn in as special constables, and there's some prominent Irish characters, including Dowling, who was the owner and the person who was in charge of the Monmouthshire Merlin. In fact, I think his relative O'Dwyer was a special constable in the Westgate during the attack. But was he correct? And this is where we flip it over again. If we look at the Protestant newspapers in Ireland, it says that the Popish and radical press on both sides of the Channel have been boasting that the gallant little band of the 45th, who so notably routed the Chartists at Newport, are Irish papists. And then it says 2/3 of them are stout-hearted, loyal, young Protestants, mostly from the north of Ireland. And I think actually that one or two of them, if you look at where they come from, not that we can find too many of them, but they are from the north of Ireland, and we know that this is still the 1830s, so this is very different to what happened in the time of troubles in the sort of 60s and 70s. But nevertheless, maybe this was a Protestant population that recruited soldiers. I think it's fascinating, actually. I mean, I must say I'm not a military historian, but when I look at this, the island is almost like some kind of aircraft carrier floating off the coast of Wales with all these regimental bases. It really is a place for recruitment for young men to find positions within the Irish military. And just I don't want to labour this point, but it really starts talking about 21 are Protestants native to Northern Ireland. And it starts talking about Catholic propaganda, and it talks particularly about Daniel O'Connell, because there was no love lost between Daniel O'Connell and the Chartists. And it talks about O'Connell's press, and it says O'Connell, nay, even his priests, felt anxious to draw distinctions and sow divisions in the army for other than loyal purposes. But they have singly failed, and they only merit the contempt of every true soldier in the British Army. And I just put this one out, I thought it was interesting. I don't know if you know this name, Peter Bussey. Fat Peter, as he was called. He was very much possibly involved in trying to make links between John Frost in South Wales and the Chartists he was from Bradford, and the Chartists in West Riding of Yorkshire. He ran pretty quickly across the United States of America and lived in New York for some time. He came back, but he describes Daniel O'Connell as that dictator to the Whig cabinet, the base, bloody and brutal traitor, Daniel O'Connell. So, were they raw Irish Catholic boys? Were they sent because they were loyal Catholic Protestants? Or were they English, Irish and Scots? Over to you, make your mind. Okay, I'm going to try and bring my talk to a conclusion. I'm going to go through some of my slides, which are quite big. What we see in Newport now, as the whole regiment began to flood into Newport, and let's make it clear, there was a lot of tension. It wasn't probably until April of 1840 that the population of Newport and the authorities felt comfortable there wasn't going to be a second rising. There was a lot of problems, particularly for the 45th in Merthyr, for example, when they went up there. There were problems with the lack of troops in Monmouth, particularly at the time of the trial, with Frost, Williams, Jones and other leading Chartists being lodged in Monmouth. There were fears that the soldiers could be quickly overwhelmed if Monmouth was swamped with Chartists. Newport didn't rest easy. All sorts of stories of, for example, a man came down one day on a horse, and the story was the Chartists were coming again very quickly. All the shops closed all the windows, their shop fronts, everybody. It wasn't true. There was another time that they heard guns going off. The military went into panic mode, and it was the Morgan family firing off cannons from Rupera Castle for the birthday of Godfrey, I think, wasn't it? So there wasn't a sense of calm. You don't we tend to think, oh well, the rising 4th of November, the soldiers won, there were arrests, that was the end of it for the Chartists. Not so. You know, this mood carried on way into the certainly 1840. And what we see in the autumn of 1839 is these celebrations, if you like. One held in the King's Head. It's the King's Head as it used to look, the old building, before it was reconfigured into the building it is today. And the praise poured upon the gallant soldiers, the gallantry and services which would never be forgotten. Major Stack, Captain Gray, Ensign Stack, the 8th Company, the 45th. You get the idea. Long pieces in the newspaper about how this regiment rescues Newport. So I'm just going to wind this up now, if I may. I just wanted to look at the postscript, what happened afterwards, very, very briefly. The job of the troops, the 45th now, was to go to Belfast. And so they were packed off to Ireland. Again, there was a meeting that took place to remember them in the Williams's Great Room, Commercial Street, to express gratitude to the gallant 45th as they were about to leave for Belfast. And there's some dispute about the ships and so on that they boarded in order to go across to Belfast. But we know that they ended up in the barracks there in Belfast, and by October the 23rd of 1839, the bulk of the 45th Regiment, numbering about 700 men, under the command of Major Montgomery, they were based there in Belfast. I don't know why, I was quite fascinated with this. They go to the theatre, and they're taken to the theatre to see a production which is all about the Battle of Waterloo, and they're paraded there. They also provide some of their band to play in concerts in the halls in Belfast. But interestingly, in the general election of 1841, when the Whig government, Melbourne's government, was severely under pressure, there were troubles in Belfast, and it was the time when Peel replaced Melbourne as Prime Minister. The Tories come back into power, and there's trouble in the streets. Who's called out to deal with it but the 45th Regiment of Foot? And yes, they're a fascinating regiment, I think, and their time in South Wales is particularly interesting. Just a couple of last ones from me then. I think the legacy, I don't know if you recognise where that is. It's St Mary's Church in Malpas. Yeah, it is. And it was there that on the 26th of November 1840, Thomas Prothero's daughter, Thomas Prothero of Malpas Court, the great enemy of John Frost, his second daughter married Jonas Stowell, and he went on to become the principal barrack master in South Africa at the Cape of Good Hope. So there's still that military connection going on as a result of the 45th being based in Newport. And to finish and to bring things right up to date, David Osmond and I have had the pleasure of having coffee with these people who are direct descendants of Lieutenant Basil Gray. And here they are at our exhibition a few months ago, and there's the restored portrait of Basil Gray. I've also had some contact with a lady who is direct descendant of Richard Stack, but at the moment I haven't got anything more than that to tell you. But I think the point I'm making here is history goes on, there's still things to be found, and we still have these contacts. I know Les, some years ago, was involved in the sort of Chartist Ancestors project, which drew in all sorts of responses from people. And I'm in the process of speaking to people now about work that I'm doing people who were there on the scene in Newport in 1839. So I think that's the fascination. So the 45th Regiment of Foot. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Let's move that over here. I think I better get out of the way to see everybody. Yes. Where do we start? There's so much. I mean, it's
I tried to squeeze a lot in there.
I mean, you know, you've really covered the ground so successfully. I mean, it's just the clarity of the questions, the issues, and what we know and what we. It's not just what you. I think you've thoroughly explored, but everyone else you know knows around here in South East Wales about this. So you know, this is really good work in progress, isn't it? In rethinking.
It is work in progress. It's not the
But
finished
that
article by any means.
history research always is. Yeah, I think the idea that somebody has written a final book, you know, is a very strange idea. But it's one that is there. It used to be in academia. I think that's changed. I hope it has. You know, you wouldn't dare. You know, the question I'd ask is, why did it take David Jones so long? Well, because I'm the wrong person to ask that, because it does take a long time finding out what he wants.
10 years. 10 years.
But there was other reasons, I suspect. He was under a cloud of. It's a brilliant book he wrote in 1985.
Yeah.
But he see, his tutor was none other than David Williams, who had written the book about John Frost, and it is an excellent book. It still stands the test of time as a biography of John Frost. What it doesn't do is really explain, if it can be explained, the Rising fully. There's so many more questions to be answered than he was able to do in something like a 12 months, it's said, but I think it was more like 18 months probably that he had. But that's an incredible short period to produce such a good book in 1939 for the centenary. But the point is that held the floor in academia after that, and because the man didn't die until 1978. He was very young when he wrote the book of like John Frost, and yes, he came back to look at it again in 1950s at the next anniversary. When would that would have been? 1950. 9, yes, it was 59. So, and there's another interesting passage, a chapter of Welsh Chartism in A.S.
Briggs.
Briggs' book.
Asa Briggs.
Asa Briggs, yeah, Asa Briggs. Which is a very useful book because it was a regional look of Chartism around the country. So
Chartist portraits.
That's the title, I can't remember. Yeah, right. Okay, so the point being that chapter was really adding to the story, but he didn't stick, he still stuck to the story. What I'm going to get at is, in the world of academia, that became the final statement to be made, sadly. And but as we know, in the 1980s, this was turned over by two books. And we had two excellent. I found this really good as a tutor and teacher in adult education and university to have at my tips two excellent books published. One in 1984 by Wilkes and 1985. And of course, we find fault in them as we go along, mistakes, errors. This is history writing. It's progress, as you say. So I just say that to back up what you said.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward to when you're going to publish.
Which? Well, do you know, I've been thinking that maybe there's some mileage in publishing some of this, but I mean, as I say, my main focus hasn't been about the subjects. I mean, there's so many, you know, it's Wales within Wales Week, there's so much. But just picking up on what Les said, I mean, David Jones is a little bit of a hero to me because he taught me, and David was such a lovely man, and I think a brilliant historian. I talked to him about when he was writing his book, and he said it had taken him 10 years to research. Have to remember there was no internet at that stage,
right.
so if you wanted to look at the newspapers, which of course are the core, I think you saw that in my presentation.
Absolutely.
Then you know you have to go and find the physical papers. If you want to look at the documents, you have to. What was the PRO in those days? The National Archives in London. You have to physically go there.
Exactly.
So his research was tremendous, but there are mistakes, and I think that as we've poured over a lot of material, particularly some of his references, I think they're wrong. and he's not around anymore, sadly. He died far too young. So I can't even ask him about that. But nevertheless, those two books that David mentioned, if you haven't looked at them, David Jones, The Last Rising, and Ivor Wilkes, South Wales and the Rising of 1839, together, if you read them in tandem, I think they are fantastic books and will give you a very, very good base. And even though it was written, as Les has said, in the 1930s, David Williams's John Foster's study in Chartism, particularly on the trial, is probably the best, actually. It's very, very well written. But David Williams was coming at the Rising as, from the perspective, it was a monster demonstration, there was no violence intended. Whereas because David Williams taught David Jones was trying to, in a sense, correct his old teacher and say this was a revolution planned, that this is what they were about to achieve a Chartist Republic. And Newport was the beginning of that story. And I think that in the mid-80s, that excited me so much because I'd never heard that before. And, and I think we've gone from there, all these different stories, and it's going off in all different directions, And I think there's some of the speakers we've had at our convention looking at the kind of landscape and how you place people onto maps and where they are in the streets to try and create this image of what Chartism, Katrina and Vikas I'm thinking of particularly. So, there's so much more that we can do. David?
I usually give a talk here, about the history of the Chartists and what happened there. When the exhibition was at the museum, the art exhibitions, the first time I really looked at the drawings that the army did, because I tell them about how they shot there. I read in the Merlin, I think, a couple of papers, and they describe, that a shot was fired from multiple sources, but the soldiers fired enfilade. So I looked up enfilade because I didn't know that, and when I saw the drawings, and they've got the 30 soldiers in a line of 2, and the drawings showed them shooting out the 3 sides, because obviously they were coming up Commercial Street and as well as down Stowe Hill. And enfilade, I discovered, is where they fire at the front, and they step to the back to load up, and they got the next 3. So it was like machine gun fire. But the big question that I partially answered there is that why they were there. Why were they there at that time? Why were there 30 soldiers in that room at the left-hand side of the West Gate? Did they get some intelligence that this was going to happen? Did they, you said that they were outside at one stage? Yeah,
I think there was intelligence. There's a lot of intelligence coming from the north of Monmouthshire, in the Iron Towns, particularly Sid Howe and Tredegar. And you've got people, Les has done a bit of work on Holman, who was working for Humphrey. They had their ears very close to the ground, and I think you can see that in the depositions afterwards. I'm particularly interested in a man called Richard Benfield, who was one of the men who was actually inside the Westgate, not doing very much actually, but he shouldn't have been there. He went on the march, he got inside the Westgate, was found by Grey and his soldiers, and ended up being sentenced to death. Now, he only lasted just over a year in prison, because the authorities knew, and I got the evidence to prove it, they knew there was no case at all. He shouldn't have been there. But his father-in-law was also arrested, and he went to the magistrates, and because he was employed by Humphrey said, no, this man is fine, and we'll let him off, and he was acquitted. But it shows how close I think they had their ears to the ground. Remember that the 45th were placed in Newport a month before the Rising, and they were there for a reason, because they were expecting trouble. But I don't think it was until maybe the last few days of October, early November, that they really thought that something was going to happen in terms of an armed revolt. It was kept very quiet, I think, and one of the reasons for that is that a lot of them were Welsh speaking. They were able to give their commands in Welsh, not exclusively. And they talked about agents provocateurs, but not a lot of evidence of that.
It doesn't make a lot of military sense, though, for them to be in the Westgate Hotel.
Well, look,
unless they
it
knew
does,
they were
it
gonna-
does.
The Westgate was a centre, and what I showed in my slides is that in the night before the rising, there was a lot of people roaming through the streets, and they went out looking for these, and some of them arrested, and some of them placed in the Westgate. They could have avoided the Westgate, but I think in some senses it was a show of strength. But the soldiers were there to do a job, and they were under the orders of the mayor that Phillips had requested them, because I think he felt that this job couldn't be done by the specials alone. They needed the soldiers. There were only 70 troops based and lodged in the workhouse. And in the end, there was only this 28 privates, 2 sergeants and Grey sent down, so half the force effectively sent down to the Westgate. And that's why we're there. Your question, which you asked at the convention about the way in which they fired, I think, that, my mind always goes back to the film Zulu when you ask that. Because what you do, just as in Africa, if you are massively outnumbered, whether it be Zulu warriors or whether it be Welsh Chartists, you have to find a way of continuous fire. Particularly with those, they're not repeater rifles, you have to physically load them. So it's a device whereby the front row fire or the back row fire, and the other row is reloading in order, so you get a constant stream of fire. They, by all odds, those men in the Westgate, those soldiers, should have been massacred. Because it wasn't that the Chartists didn't have the weapons to deal with; they did have guns. Some of them even had names inscribed on the rifle butts of who they were going to kill. We can romanticise George Shell, but he was there to kill people, even though he was a teenage young man. Did you want to say something like that?
How did the authorities know what the Chartists were up to? Of course, there were, you can call them agents provocateurs, or you can call them informers. There were people definitely informing on what the Chartists were doing. So all the meetings they had, secret meetings that were taking place in October, there were people there who were then reporting back to Newport, because that became the nerve centre with the magistrate. The head magistrate was Thomas Phillips, rather, who was mayor, head magistrate. He was at the centre of it, effectively, but really the man who pulled everything together was another Thomas Phillips, Thomas Jones Phillips. Now, I could talk about a lot about him. People do get muddled between these two individuals. Now he wasn't he'd been sent up on the Sunday. Where had he gone? Tredegar. He was in Tredegar. He'd been up and down the valley for months, this man. He was an energetic Welsh-speaking magistrate secretary, an attorney in Newport. Now, this man been around quite a long time. He was at the centre of a spy system set up, connected to the Bute estate in Cardiff Castle. There's a triangle here. Captain, I've forgotten his name for the moment, but the captain in charge of the army in Cardiff is connected with Newport. The idea that this is all happening, it's the authorities and the Chartists are planning. That's the reality. The Chartists are talking, they've been talking for months about the idea of a march on Newport. Frost had actually restrained them. The last thing he wanted was a march on Newport. He did everything on the night he could to slow things down. And I think we've got to see that there's a game going on here, and it's going way back in time, because the 29th was billeted in Newport. The army generally in Britain was billeted because they didn't have the garrisons. They didn't, outside Devizes and places like that in the south. They had nothing in the north of England. And Napier, in charge up there, was absolutely desperately worried about soldiers being killed because they came home from the pubs to the billet with somebody's house. They were just planted in the local population. They were vulnerable, as were the 29th in Newport. And hence the talk about taking them prisoner and so on, or forcing them to. That's why many of them ended up deserting.
To get back to...
No, but the point is, you ask how did they...
Why were they there?
They were there
Why
for
didn't they
military
attack-
reasons.
Why didn't they attack the town hall? Or
There was no town hall.
Why did they go past the
There was no
barracks?
town hall.
Where they were...
No, not till 1840s was there a town hall.
In 42 was the first town hall.
They went past the barracks where the soldiers
Yes.
would have been.
Yeah.
So that
No, they
seemed
didn't
rather
go.
odd.
No, hold on. That's the point. Everyone thinks they came along the Risco Road. No, they didn't.
Ah,
Right? Everyone talks as if they came along the Risco war, saying hello to the soldiers in the workhouse, the new workhouse, not yet used as a workhouse. They had no longer billeted in houses. They are in a garrison. That's their garrison, that building. Now, the Chartists deliberately, at least the leaders, deliberately avoided a confrontation there by going a long way around. I mean, it took me a long time when I first came to Newport to fathom out what on earth were they doing in Tredegar Park? Were they aiming to attack Tredegar House? That might have been on the mind of some of them. They didn't, because under the control of Frost, he brought them that way to avoid the Risco Road. But they came from Cavan, from the pub, what's the pub?
The Welsh Oak.
The Welsh Oak. That's where they had been congregating all night. Frost was there from just after midnight and waiting for Zephaniah Williams to come with his force and waiting for some, eventually 300 men from Pontypool. I mean, again, that hoary story, they never came. They did, they came over, 300 of them. But what is left out of the story is that there were anything between 1,000 and 2,000 men right just beyond the castle, Newport Castle. So to answer your question, the last thing they wanted to do was have their base. The mayor had made the Westgate his HQ. Because there they were, because originally they always met, the magistrates always met in the King's Head.
As they did after the depositions, that's where they
Yes.
met afterwards for the
Yes,
magistrates.
But they used the Westgate as a headquarters. And they encouraged, I think, the idea of marching down there. They were tempting in a way because it was well known they were prisoners. And that one of the reasons for attacking the building was not to get the mayor necessarily, that's a good story told by the authorities. It was to get their prisoners out, their friends who had been taken in there overnight. But when they got to the Cardiff Road, they got to the Waterloo pub, which was at the bottom of Waterloo Hill. They settled along there for a while. They waited at the Cortabella
Weighing machine.
weighing machine, which was situated at the bottom of Bellevue Lane. So those of you who know Newport will know exactly where they are. And they then had a choice. Did they go further along the Cardiff Road and get to Commercial Street and come in that way? If you want to get to the Westgate, that would have been the best way. But they were encouraged by whoever to head up towards the top of Bellevue Lane, which meant they were actually, Frost was obviously worried about this because they were going to get close to the soldiers. But when they got to the top of the hill, they kept their order and went down Stowe Hill. There was a phalanx of special constables across the road. But they knew about, they was obviously aiming for the HQ. They wanted to, that was very much in their minds, that this was where they were going to congregate. Frost thought they'd congregate and probably negotiate with the magistrates. The same sort of thing that happened they hoped in Merthyr, if you remember, the Merthyr Rising. They all went there because the magistrates were in there. Well, there were a few magistrates, only two, I think. The mayor and Brewer inside the hotel. So to answer your question, they were funneled. Were they actually sort of kettled down there? Because it's a very narrow road. It may be 5,000 Chartists, but from the army's point of view, that was brilliant because they were straddled up the road, weren't they? And the only way they could run away was back up the hill. And they trampled on each other as they made their way. And Zephaniah Williams never made the hotel. He was trampled trying to escape. He was at the back end of the march coming in. He was keeping the people in line, doing the right thing, keeping them orderly. And they were not a rabble coming down Stowe Hill. They were organised in a very, very organised way.
Just another point to sort of address David's question as well. I think we shouldn't underestimate the lines of communication between the authorities.
Yes.
When Cardo, for example, was one of the Charters Convention arrived in Newport, he basically came to the West Gate and stayed there and was quizzing the landlord, was arrested by the magistrates and investigated. It's quite clear that he'd come down from the Midlands by coach, that the authorities in Birmingham had been straight on to Thomas Phillips, so he knew before he arrived from Birmingham that information. I know from a character, Jenkin Morgan, my Pill milkman that I've done work on, he went to Cardiff and to get a boat to Bristol. He was arrested in Bristol by his neighbours, by people from Newport. Why? Because they already knew he was in Bristol, and they were able to time it so they got a boat from Newport to arrive in Bristol before the Cardiff boat got there. They were there lying in wait for him. It wasn't a coincidence. If you read some of the books, by coincidentally, you know, this man sees him in the bunch of grapes and says, "You were J.K. Morgan, the Chartist." Rubbish. This guy lived 100 yards away from where he did in Pill. That's too big a coincidence. They were there lying in wait for him. Again, the level of sophistication within the military, the police, the authorities, far, even though without the internet and telephones that we have today, it's amazing. I think they knew an awful lot what was. You might remember the police force was incredibly small in 1839. Outside of London, it was virtually non-existent. So,
It's Hopkins plus half a dozen.
yeah. Bristol.
One of those was for Pill.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Yeah.
That's all right, no problem at all. Can we go back to the Irish Catholics, the Irish Protestants and the English? Because there's nothing I like more than when people are telling different stories about the same thing. And there's one search that you could do, which is to establish how many were Catholics, how many were Protestants. But in a way, I'm much more interested in who had vested interests in the different stories. I mean, for example, the one we always quote is, 1 minute they were saying, there were only a few hundred. The next minute, when it suited them to get a treason conviction, there were many thousands. So you raise the numbers, you lower the numbers according to the story you want to tell. So would these stories, for example, have an effect on other areas that were thinking of rising, or was it important to show that the Irish were on the side of?
I think the big thing is how loyal were the Irish.
Right.
Okay, I think it is a question within the Constitution. I mean, Ireland had been merged into the United Kingdom in 1800, 1801, and I think there were always doubts, and in the 1820s and 1830s, particularly in some of the valley towns, there's a lot of trouble between the Irish and the Welsh. There's fears that they're going to undercut, in terms of employment, they undercut their wages. There are race riots, effectively, against the Irish. You must remember, even before the potato famine of the 1840s, the Irish were extremely poor in the boats that they came on. And it was said that you could tell an Irishman on the streets of Merthyr just by looking at them by the way they were dressed. And we know that that's borne out by some of the evidence. You can read, Chris Williams is coming to us in November to the convention. He's written a brilliant piece about the Irish community in Newport. It's based a bit later on the 1851 census, but nevertheless, I think you can extrapolate backwards on it. And I think there is this question. I mean, I've been doing some work with Les and David recently, with Steve Poole and Roger Ball, about what happened in Bristol in 1831. And one of the things that they raise is what happened on Guy Fawkes Night. Now, remember, the Newport Rising was the 4th of November. It was said that it was originally scheduled for the 5th of November because of Guy Fawkes. And if you read the accounts, and there are some great accounts in the Merlin of this, it was absolute bedlam and chaos. Because people would actually be throwing, effectively, bombs around, lighted barrels of tar would be rolling around and throwing things around. And I think for the Chartists, they thought this was a very good, literally and metaphorically, a smoke screen behind which they could hide. And one of the points that Steve and particularly Roger were making was, does this incorporate feelings because it remembers what happened in the 17th century? Does it incorporate resentment, antagonism towards the Irish community because they were Catholic?
Yeah.
From what I've read, I think it wasn't anti-Catholic. I think a lot of it were people who were just drunk looking for a good, excuse to do what the hell they like, to act in a lawless way. But nevertheless, there is that overriding question in the early 19th century, could you trust Irish Catholics? You could trust Irish Protestants because they represented usually a different community and very often to do with land and a higher social class. But when we're talking about Irish labourers who are Catholic, I think they're not trusted. You see it. You can see it in the early 1900s in America as well. Some of when I used to teach American history, you see this in the early 1900s with Irish labourers being made out as being buffoons, basically, and characterised as being idiots, along with black American workers. They're in the same, these are the people on the fringes of American society. There's an element of that in Britain. But having said that, in Newport, I think there's a lot of integration as well. Because I said, Dowling, who was in charge of the Merlin, was an Irishman. There were lots of Irish who were influential. But again, you've got this story, which was peddled by the authorities, that no Irish were involved in supporting the Chartists in Newport. I don't think that's true either.
No.
Because, I think it was only Rourke who was convicted, but you've got this, we know about people in Pill, for example, like Hickey, Patrick Hickey had an Irish section who was involved in going up to the Marshes Gate from Pill and leading the Pontypool Chartists into Newport to help them take over the town. But that again, that's an area of history that we've got to do an awful lot of digging to find, and we're not there yet. But what was the level of support amongst the Irish community? And let's face it, there was quite a big Irish, not only in Newport, but in Cardiff in particular, and that's another issue. And Cardiff is one of the highest, certainly in the after the famine, with the highest census, I think only second to Liverpool, of Irish population coming in.
I still would question the nature of it. It was not the poorest Irish who came before the famine, 45, 46. It tended to be quite middle class. Some of them are doctors.
I think it's a mixture, Les.
It is a mixture.
I think there's a lot
skilled,
of poor,
the workers were highly skilled workers, stonemasons, people of that ilk. The little I've done into Catholics, and a lot of them were Protestants, Irish Protestants. The Beattie family, who done in Pill, and Cortabella, who got involved with the Chartists.
Jenky Morgan. And Jenky Morgan with the burning of the hayrick.
That one. They were Protestants. Yes. If they had a religion, but they weren't highly religious.
It's a bit like saying, Indian people coming as migrants into Britain. You can have people from all different castes. We can't just put an overall label on them and say, oh, they're Irish.
Absolutely right.
And I think, particularly, maybe not so much in Newport, because Newport was very much a merchant-based society. But in the valley towns, there were a lot of poor Irish, and there was this fear of undercutting, and there was
later
violence.
On. That's post 1839.
No, there's before this.
Right,
I can send you some of the evidence.
I am, because I haven't found any. I'm looking at the coal mining at the moment in the 20s and 30s in the Argoid area and so on. Not yet found much evidence of anti-Irish or Irish presence. There's a lot of people from other places other than Wales. Most are from Wales. The Welsh language is flourishing. They're from Breconshire, they're from Carmarthenshire. The great wave of even English people coming in, it only goes as far as Blaenavon and places like that. It's very much a Welsh community in the Sahawi Valley, certainly. So I've not found Irish until later. And of course, yes, it becomes a problem. But the biggest problem of all in that valley with coal mining are people coming from Somerset. And they're coming in at this time, beginning to, and later on, of course, big troubles occur because the Somerset men are willing to cut coal
Yeah.
in an entirely different way, the long haul, the long wall
Yeah.
system,
Yeah.
and that causes disputes and accusations of undercutting with labour.
Should we have just one more question here?
Anyway, sorry.
No, that gentleman there.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I think this is a whole area that deserves a lot more
More, yeah.
investigation, actually, because it's bothered me for some time. As far as I know, the first anti-Irish riot in Wales was in 1826,
Right, that was a...
Yeah.
where Irish workers were brought in to help construct a new furnace.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the way in which the Irish first came into many areas, was as construction workers,
Yeah.
whether for building or later for railways and possibly earlier for canals, but less of that. I think that was as significant. I think we also have to be careful with this question about just talking of the early 19th century. There's a lot happened
Big period.
over that time. Obviously you had the events in Ireland leading up to the defeat of the United Irishmen in 1798 and so on. But the Irish were a huge presence in the British Army.
Absolutely.
Of course, Ireland at that point had a third of the population of England. It wasn't the imbalance that we have
That's right.
now. And I think I've seen figures that say at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a third of the army and a quarter of the navy were Irish. That's a huge proportion. Of course, a lot more came from the Scottish Highlands as well after the defeat of the Jacobins. And I think the concern about the Irish probably comes from the 20s and 30s onwards, because there isn't a lot of sort of popular protest in Ireland, as I understand it, in that first quarter of the century after the defeat of the United Irishmen. And so it starts from the second quarter and then, of course, is continuous. So you probably did have a lot of concern in the 30s because this was starting up again. It seemed earlier in the century it had been pacified, but it was now coming back. One of the questions that interests me is quite fascinating what you were saying about the level of desertion and the contrast between that and yet the obeying of orders at the key moments. And of course it was, at least it was said by Frost and by others that it will be okay, the soldiers will desert, they'll come over to us and so on. I don't know if anybody knows of any cases in Britain in the 19th century where soldiers actually refused orders in those circumstances. I can't think of, Peterloo, they fired, in other cases they've gone in, they went to Merthyr on many occasions and so on. And the army does seem to have preserved its military order despite the levels of dissatisfaction and of desertion. And
Of course,
I don't think
they weren't needed on a regular basis anyway,
No.
because most of it was dealt with by the militia and the yeomanry,
Yes.
and that was the main vehicle to deal with small pockets of resistance and an upheaval. And I'm sure in those cases, and I don't know of any specific examples, I'm sure there must have been some cases of people not
The
following.
yeomanry, part of the problem there was you were mobilising. The yeomanry effectively was mixed with the local gentry and shopocracy, but with a local base. Whereas quite often, one of the things that was done with the professional army was, as you were saying, with the 29th and the 45th, you move them around.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
you move them around quite
That's right,
quickly,
that's
so they haven't got time to build any local relationships that might disturb loyalty
That's
at
right,
that point.
that's
You
right.
don't know the people you're firing on.
That's right. But Les's point about the buttes as well is true there. I know from the work that I've done on the Vale of Glamorgan and the yeomanry there, which ties into, strangely enough, Jenkin Morgan, Chartist, convicted of treason,
Yeah.
was actually a member of the Bridgend Militia, and his brother was a member of the Yeomanry. So I think there's a Captain Howells who was part of that as well. It's all going through you can get hold of the papers actually, and it's all in there. So I think you're right. I think when the soldiers, the paid soldiers, were given the opportunity to follow commands almost exclusively, they did as they were told.
The basic question was asked though, in whose interest was it? That was a very good question. It crossed my mind. Who gained from this Protestant versus Catholic thing, do you think, in this situation? I don't quite understand the motives of O'Connell, other than he fell out with the Charters. He was originally, he signed the Charter in the first case in 1836-7.
Excuse us, Les, we're in danger of starting another conversation about a whole different topic.
But we need to come back to that.
Yeah,
I think that's what I'm saying.
We'll come back. We'll invite you as well.
No, I don't need to be invited. I'm just asking the question. It's such a good question. We need to explore it. It puzzles me. I can't.
Well, our time has run out, I'm afraid. We have to throw you out in a minute. So
yeah, I know.
And I don't want to beat you with sticks, because...
So can I just make one nice one?
You're the guy, you don't want to be bigger than the other.
David,
Don't
are you
shoot
all
us.
prepared to leave?
David,
Or not?